The spring air was warm and filled with anticipation as guests streamed into the Washington Hilton's International Ballroom for the 1986 White House Correspondents' Association Dinner. The annual event, often dubbed Nerd Prom by those in attendance, brought together the most powerful figures in Washington politics and media for an evening of speeches, awards, and most memorably comedy that walked the fine line between respectful ribbing and cutting political satire. This year's entertainment featured Danny Morrison, a rising comedian from Los Angeles who had gained national attention for his sharp political impressions and fearless willingness to take shots at politicians from both parties. Morrison, 34, had built his career on an uncanny ability to capture not just the vocal mannerisms of public figures, but their psychological quirks and unconscious habits. His impression of President Reagan had become legendary in comedy clubs across the country, and tonight would mark the first time he performed it directly in front of his subject. President Reagan sat at the head table alongside First Lady Nancy Reagan, members of his cabinet, and prominent journalists. At 75, he remained one of the most popular presidents in modern history. But the Iran-Contra scandal had begun to take its toll on his approval ratings, and critics were increasingly questioning whether his communication skills were beginning to decline with age. Morrison had spent weeks preparing for this performance, crafting material that he believed pushed the boundaries of political humor without crossing into outright disrespect. His signature Reagan impression focused heavily on what he perceived as the president's increasingly halting speech patterns, his tendency to pause mid-sentence, and what Morrison characterized as a growing disconnect between Reagan's confident public persona and what the comedian saw as signs of cognitive decline. As Morrison took the podium after dinner, the room buzzed with anticipation. The comedian was known for his fearless approach to political humor, and everyone present understood that they were about to witness something that could either be brilliantly entertaining or spectacularly uncomfortable. Thank you very much," Morrison began in his own voice before immediately shifting into his Reagan impression. "Well, let me just say, it's wonderful to be here tonight with all you folks from the the press corps." The impression was devastating in its accuracy. Morrison had perfectly captured Reagan's vocal patterns, including the slight hesitations, the way his voice would sometimes trail off, and the particular rhythm of his speech. But there was something else in the performance, a subtle mockery, that suggested these speech patterns indicated more than just natural aging. "You know," Morrison continued in the Reagan voice, "Nancy and I were just hey, we were just discussing this evening, and she said What did you say, dear?" "Oh yes, she said." "Well, I don't exactly remember what she said, but I'm sure it was very supportive." Nervous laughter rippled through the audience. The joke was technically about Reagan's well-known deference to his wife's opinions, but the implication was darker, that the president might be having memory issues. Morrison pressed on, his impression becoming more exaggerated. "I was reading my briefing notes today, Well, actually, I was looking at the pictures in my briefing notes, and I thought to myself, what was I thinking about? Oh yes, the economy. The economy it's doing very very. What's the word I'm looking for? Nancy, what's that word that means good?" The laughter in the room became more strained. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others laughed more loudly, perhaps to cover their own discomfort. At the head table, Reagan's expression remained pleasant and attentive, but those who knew him well could see a slight tightening around his eyes. Morrison continued for another 5 minutes, his routine becoming increasingly focused on portraying Reagan as confused, forgetful, and overly dependent on handlers and cue cards. The climax came when Morrison, still in character as Reagan, pretended to lose his place in his own speech. In conclusion, wait, am I concluding? I thought I was still introducing myself. Could someone remind me what I was talking about? Oh yes, America. America is like, it's like a thing that's very American. The routine ended to polite but notably restrained applause. Morrison smiled and waved, clearly pleased with his performance, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. What had started as traditional political humor had evolved into something that felt more like public humiliation. As Morrison returned to his seat, the evening's program continued with the traditional presidential response. It was customary for the president to offer his own humorous remarks, usually gentle self-deprecation mixed with good-natured shots at the press and political opponents. Reagan rose from his seat slowly, his movement deliberate and dignified. As he approached the podium, the room fell silent, everyone wondering how he would respond to Morrison's pointed performance. The president adjusted the microphone slightly, looked out over the audience with his characteristic warm smile, and began to speak. His voice was clear, strong, and unmistakably in control. "Thank you, Danny, for that interpretation of my speaking style," Reagan said, his tone mild and conversational. "You know, it's interesting to see myself through someone else's eyes, even if those eyes might need to visit an optometrist." Light laughter rippled through the room, but the tension remained palpable. Reagan continued, his voice taking on a more reflective quality. "Danny, I have to say, your impression of me is quite detailed. You've clearly spent a lot of time studying my speech patterns, my mannerisms, even my relationship with Nancy. That kind of attention to detail suggests real talent and dedication to your craft." Morrison looked surprised. He had expected defensiveness, anger, or at least some form of counterattack. Instead, Reagan was complimenting his work. "But I'd like to share something with you about this voice you've been imitating," Reagan said, his tone becoming more personal. "This voice that sometimes hesitates, that occasionally searches for the right word, that speaks more slowly than it used to. There's a story behind it that I think might interest you." The room was completely silent now, everyone absorbed in Reagan's response. This voice carried a sports announcer through the Great Depression, describing baseball games I couldn't see to audiences who needed something to believe in during the darkest economic times in our nation's history. This voice convinced studios to give an unknown actor from Illinois a chance in Hollywood. This voice stood up to studio bosses when they tried to blacklist talented people for their political beliefs. Reagan's voice grew stronger, more resonant. This voice negotiated with Congress to pass tax reform that helped millions of American families keep more of what they earned. This voice told Mr. Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. This voice has comforted families who lost loved ones in service to their country and celebrated with communities when their children came home safely. The president paused, looking directly at Morrison. "Danny, you're absolutely right that this voice sometimes hesitates now, that it searches for words that used to come easily. That's what happens when a voice has been speaking publicly for over 50 years, when it's addressed Congress and world leaders and grieving families and celebrating crowds." Reagan's tone became gentler, more intimate. "But here's what I want you to understand. Every pause, every hesitation, every moment when I search for the right word, that's not confusion or decline. That's the weight of responsibility. When you know that your words can affect millions of lives, when you understand that a carelessly chosen phrase can damage relationships between nations or give false hope to struggling families, you learn to choose your words very carefully." The room was absolutely still. Morrison's confident smile had faded, replaced by a look of growing discomfort. "You see, Danny, the difference between comedy and leadership is that comedians get to say whatever gets the biggest laugh. Leaders have to live with the consequences of every word they speak." Reagan moved away from the podium slightly, his posture becoming more conversational. "Now, I'm not criticizing your profession. Comedy is vital to a healthy democracy. It keeps politicians humble, it challenges authority, and it helps people cope with the stress of living in an imperfect world. You have a talent for making people laugh, and that's a gift." The president's voice took on a more serious tone. "But I want to suggest something to you. Real comedy, the kind that endures, the kind that matters, doesn't come from mocking people's vulnerabilities or suggesting that public servants are incompetent or declining. Real comedy comes from finding the truth in human situations, from helping people see themselves and their world more clearly." Reagan looked out over the audience, taking in the faces of journalists, politicians, and entertainers. Every person in this room has experienced moments when they couldn't find the right words, when they felt uncertain, when they wondered if they were equal to the challenges they faced. That's not a sign of weakness or incompetence. That's a sign of humanity. The president's gaze returned to Morrison. "Danny, you have the ability to make people laugh, and that's wonderful. But you also have the ability to make people think, to help them understand complex issues, to bring out the best in human nature, rather than exploiting its weaknesses." Reagan's voice grew warmer, more encouraging. "Instead of mocking the way people speak, you could help audiences understand why they speak that way. Instead of suggesting that hesitation indicates confusion, you could show how thoughtfulness differs from indecision. Instead of making people feel superior to their leaders, you could help them understand the challenges of leadership." The president paused, then delivered the line that would be remembered long after the evening ended. "The voice you imitated tonight has learned that the most powerful words are often the ones spoken softly, after careful thought, with full awareness of their impact. Perhaps your voice could learn that lesson too." The room erupted in sustained applause, but it was different from the polite response to Morrison's routine. This applause carried genuine emotion, respect, and appreciation for both Reagan's grace under fire and his thoughtful response to public mockery. Morrison sat in stunned silence, his face flushed with what appeared to be a mixture of embarrassment and genuine reflection. He had come to the dinner expecting to score points with a brilliant impersonation, but instead found himself on the receiving end of a masterclass in dignity and leadership. As Reagan returned to his seat, he paused briefly beside Morrison's table. "Danny," he said quietly, extending his hand, "I hope you'll consider what I said tonight. You have real talent, and I'd hate to see it wasted on cheap shots." Morrison stood and shook the president's hand, his voice barely audible as he replied, "Mr. President, I need to think about this. Thank you for not just dismissing what I did." "Everyone deserves the chance to grow, son," Reagan replied with his characteristic warmth. "That's what America is all about." In the days following the dinner, clips of both Morrison's routine and Reagan's response spread through news, broadcasts, and newspaper coverage across the country. But while Morrison's impression was largely forgotten within weeks, Reagan's response became part of his enduring legacy as a communicator and leader. The exchange sparked broader conversations about the nature of political humor, the responsibility of entertainers, and the way public figures should respond to criticism and mockery. Comedy clubs and entertainment industry publications debated whether Reagan had successfully defended himself or had simply used his platform to silence legitimate criticism. Morrison himself underwent a significant transformation in the wake of the dinner. In interviews over the following months, he spoke candidly about how Reagan's response had forced him to reconsider not just his approach to political comedy, but his understanding of what it meant to use humor responsibly. "He didn't attack me or try to destroy my career," Morrison told Rolling Stone magazine 6 months later. "He challenged me to be better, to think more deeply about what I was doing and why I was doing it. That's not what I expected from a politician, especially one I had just publicly mocked." Morrison began incorporating Reagan's insights into his comedy, developing routines that were still funny but focused more on illuminating human nature than exploiting human weaknesses. His career flourished as a result, with critics noting that his humor had gained depth and sophistication while retaining its edge. Years later, When Morrison had become one of the most respected political comedians in the country, he would often reference his encounter with Reagan as a pivotal moment in his professional development. "He taught me that the goal of comedy shouldn't be to make people feel superior to others," Morrison would say in interviews. "The goal should be to help people understand themselves and their world better. That's harder than just getting cheap laughs, but it's more worthwhile." For Reagan, the encounter reinforced his belief that leadership often meant responding to hostility with grace, to criticism with reflection, and to personal attacks with dignity. His response to Morrison became a template for how public figures could defend themselves without destroying their critics. The incident also highlighted Reagan's understanding of the power of words and the responsibility that came with using them effectively. By acknowledging Morrison's talent while challenging him to use it more constructively, Reagan demonstrated that effective leadership sometimes meant teaching rather than punishing. Most importantly, the exchange showed that even in the rough and tumble world of Washington politics, it was possible to maintain civility and mutual respect while engaging in serious disagreements about important issues. The story of Reagan's response to Morrison's mockery became part of political folklore, cited by communication experts, leadership coaches, and public speaking instructors as an example of how to handle criticism with grace and turn a potentially damaging situation into an opportunity for education and growth. But perhaps the most lasting impact of that evening was the reminder that behind every public figure, regardless of their politics or popularity, is a human being with a lifetime of experiences, challenges, and achievements that shape how they communicate and lead. Reagan's calm response changed the room not through anger or retaliation, but through a simple reminder of the complexity and dignity inherent in every human voice, especially those entrusted with speaking for millions of others. In an era of increasingly harsh political discourse, the exchange between Morrison and Reagan served as a model for how public figures could respond to criticism and mockery with both strength and grace, turning moments of potential conflict into opportunities for mutual understanding and growth.